Hey YouTube, in this video I'm going to be now going over MSI's X670 motherboards and X670E motherboards. So these are the three that were available at launch, and they're still available now. So we're going to kind of dive into these three in particular. So the Pro X670-P Wi-Fi, the Carbon, so the X670E Carbon Wi-Fi, and then the kind of the flagship, so the Meg X670 Ace. So that's the EATX board. So it's kind of the premium one. There are more outside of these three, but I just picked three that I thought were good in terms of like the most budget-friendly one. We'll do that one first. So it's going to be the Pro, and then the middle of the line one. So that's going to be the MPG Carbon, and then we're going to look at the flagship one at the end. As with how I've done this format of videos with ASRock and Gigabyte previously, I like to go to the product page just to kind of look, and MSI, I will say, does have the best overall presentation in terms of they have a data sheet that you can download. It's a PDF file, but they do kind of do a really good job organizing things. I do think they have the best in terms of the website. I think that they've done it the best. They have the overview page, which is kind of the marketing stuff, but then they also have like the spec sheet like this, which I like. And then the thing I really like about it is they show you the back panel ports, and they have the labeling right here on the product page, so you don't have to go to a motherboard manual to see this. But like I have said in previous videos, I still do prefer looking at the manual, because the manual does give us the full details in terms of the block diagram. Now, unfortunately, unlike ASRock and Gigabyte, which provided the block diagram for all three, the budget-friendly one, the middle-of-the-road one, and then the high-end flagship one, ASRock and Gigabyte have given the block diagram for all three of those. But MSI, unfortunately, for the budget-friendly Pro, they don't have the block diagram in their manual. Now, they do have the block diagram for the other ones, which we'll look at later. But for the most cost-effective one, so this Pro X670P Wi-Fi is, it's $289. So it's essentially the same price as the Gigabyte Aorus Elite. So, and it lacks the debug code just like the Gigabyte board. However, the ASRock one did lack it as well. But they don't have the block diagram. So what I've had to do is I've had to actually draw out the block diagram. So we're going to go ahead and detail that now for you guys that are watching. If you're interested in getting an AM5 platform and you don't want to spend a whole lot of money, I do think that this MSI motherboard is worth considering because it does have a lot of good connectivity here in terms of how they've allocated the resources. So this is a X670 motherboard, so it is not going to feature the full 24 lanes of Gen 5. That would be the X670E platform. So this one does give you a Gen 5 bus at the top that goes to the CPU for a primary M.2 slot. So that's going to be a Gen 5 capable M.2 slot. The rest of the CPU lanes are going to be Gen 4, so that is a cost-saving measure that does make the X670 platform more affordable than the flagship X670E Enthusiast platform. So you do get your graphics card 16 lanes, and then you get an expansion slot PCIe X4, which is Gen 4 capable. So that's really nice. This will be a nice one for like a capture card. Now, the thing I will note about MSI in particular for AM5 is the only motherboard vendor out of the four big ones that we're covering on this channel that has omitted USB 4 and Thunderbolt support from the AMD platform. So that is kind of a big negative on MSI's part. I do think that it would have been nice to have the Thunderbolt header option for an add-in card, but the motherboards that we're looking at here do not offer that as an option. So no Thunderbolt support, or you can't add it or anything like that. I mean, you can try to add a Thunderbolt card to this PCIe slot. I don't know if it will work because you will not have the Thunderbolt header on the motherboard, so there's no control plane signaling as far as I know. But it might work, but your mileage may vary. So that's going to be it for the CPU PCIe lanes. Of course, you do get some USB ports off of the CPU as well, which we're not really going to talk about. It's kind of standard stuff. You can look at the motherboard specifications to see that, but that's kind of already understood for AM5 at this point. So moving on to the primary chipset. So this is going to be for the downlink. This is PCIe 4.0 X4 lanes, and then the link between the two chipsets, the secondary and the primary, are also X4 lanes. So moving down here, so you do have 4 lanes available. They've wired that to the second M.2 slot. And then for the 3.0 or SATA ports, there are 4 lanes available there. So 2 of them go to 2 of the SATA drives. 1 lane goes to a PCIe X1 expansion slot. And then what they've done for the last lane is they're leveraging an ASMedia 1061 chip to basically split and drive 2 SATA drives off of 1 PCIe 3.0 lane, as opposed to like 1 lane per drive natively, which is what we've got here. They're doing it a little bit differently there. So these 2 will not support RAID because they're doing that, but you can RAID these 2 together. And likewise on the secondary chipset, you have 2 more. You can RAID those as well. So 6 SATA ports total for legacy storage options. So that's really nice to see. And then that's going to compose your primary chipset. And then for the secondary chipset, the 4.0 bus down here has 8 lanes available. So 4 of them go to an M.2 drive, and the remaining 4 go to a switch, which then gives you the option of either running a 4th M.2 drive, which I think most people will probably do. But you also do have a additional PCIe. They call it PCIe 4 is the name on the board. But for some reason, I will note that this one, I have wrote 2 here. So this one is only wired electrically for 2 lanes. As far as I know, the M.2 drive is 4 lanes, but I'm not 100% sure. It's not documented well in the manual, so it's unclear to me whether or not this final M.2 drive is X4 or if it's only X2 like the expansion slot. So that's going to be the 4.0 bus, so all lanes are accounted for there. And then for the second PCIe 3 bus off of the secondary chipset, you have 2 more SATA ports, and then you have your Wi-Fi 6E and your 2.5 gig LAN. So everything is accounted for on this X670 motherboard from MSI. So that's going to be it for that one. If we now turn our attention to the Carbon Wi-Fi, so this is kind of the middle of the road one. So this is kind of like the Aorus Master in terms of the price point. So this one is it's under $500. So if we check Newegg at time of filming, this one is coming in at $479. Micro Center is also $479. So it is kind of the middle of the road option. Now, I say middle of the road, but that is really, really expensive for most people. So this is kind of the upper end of where I would recommend spending money on a motherboard. Anything above that, and then you're kind of in the enthusiast category, and then it's really, really hard to justify additional cost to a motherboard at these price points. But this one does kind of cover it all in terms of what you get. So if we look at the block diagram here, you do get that PCIe X16, and now this is a typo on their actual block diagram. This is actually 5.0 because this is an X670E. This is going to be 24 lanes of Gen 5. We want to double check that. We can look at the product page, and sure enough, they are saying PCIe 1 is 5.0 and E2 is also 5.0. So that's going to be these 2. I just want to make sure, I want to clarify for everybody watching this video that even though it says PCIe 4.0, this is actually PCIe 5.0. So this is 5.0 16 lanes, and then you also do have that potential. You can run that by 8 slot, that second slot, for either NVMe storage or whatever you want, or a second GPU or whatever. So that's there. It's nice to have that as an option. That's kind of rare to see these days on more and more motherboards. So you get an HDMI port, a display port. You get a USB 3.2 Gen 2 10 gig port that does have DisplayPort alt mode, so you can drive 3 monitors off of the primary, or off of the integrated graphics on this motherboard, so via that CPU. So that's really nice. And then for the other 8 lanes of Gen 5, they go to storage, so 4 of them go to the primary, M.2, so that's a Gen 5 NVMe slot, and then you have another Gen 5 NVMe slot. So this is very similar to what we saw on the Gigabyte Aorus Master in terms of how they've allocated the CPU lanes. So pretty much the same thing, and a very similar price point. In fact, the MSI one is a little bit cheaper than the Aorus Master, but I will say again that MSI does lack the option for Thunderbolt. So if Thunderbolt 4 or USB 4 is something that you wanted to add to your motherboard, it's going to be very hit or miss for MSI unless there's an ASMedia add-in card for USB 4 that comes out later that will be compatible with these motherboards. So, but no Intel Thunderbolt available on this motherboard, or in fact any of the MSI X670 motherboards. So for the primary chipset, you have another M.2, so that's going to be all 4 of those Gen 4 lanes. And then for the Gen 3 lanes, you have 4 SATA ports. So they're using all 4 of the Gen 3 lanes for 4 SATA drives, or SATA ports. So that's really good. Interestingly, they have wired the audio to the chipset as opposed to the CPU. That doesn't really matter too much, but it is something that makes it look more like an Intel motherboard. And then for the secondary chipset, for the Gen 4 lanes, we have 8 of them available. So it looks like 4 of them go to 1 NVMe drive. So that's going to be your last NVMe drive because there were 2 up here, and then 1 there and 1 there. So that's 4 M.2 drives total. So that gives you 4 more lanes of Gen 4 that are still available. And what they have done, they've done a really nice thing. I like this. They give you a 4.0 X4 expansion slot that does not share lanes or bandwidth with any other component on the motherboard. So that's really nice to see. That's going to be the bottom slot here. It's a native Gen 4 PCIe slot. So that's really nice to see. So that's how they've allocated their lanes. That's a really good choice, in my opinion, of how they've done that. And then for the Gen 3 lanes, there's 4. 2 of them go to SATA, so you get 6 SATA ports. And then the remaining 2 lanes, one of them is going to the 2.5 gigabit LAN, so using a Gen 3 lane for that. And then the final Gen 3 lane is going to the Wi-Fi 6E. So out of all the motherboards that we've looked at, I do think this one is a very, very nice choice. If you're someone who doesn't care about USB 4 and Thunderbolt, this is probably going to be my recommendation if you want to pick up an MSI motherboard. Yes, it's very pricey, but again, you're getting 24 lanes of Gen 5. You do have the forward compatibility. You can drop in a newer Ryzen, CPU like Zen 5 or whatever at some point in the future. You can upgrade that and keep the same motherboard. So I do like the way that they have laid out what they've done with the resources, how they've chosen to give you a Gen 4 slot that doesn't steal lanes from anything else. You get the 4 NVMEs, 2 of which are full Gen 5 capable, and they run off the CPU. So overall, very, very nice motherboard layout from MSI. This one's probably going to be a good recommendation from me. So that's going to be it for the Carbon Wi-Fi. Now we're going to look at the final motherboard. So this is going to be the Meg X670E Ace. So this one is the flagship. Now there is a Godlike, I know that, but it's $1,300. That's way too expensive, and there isn't really anything that motherboard does that makes it better than the Ace. So with the Ace, what's cool is you do get this expander PCIe add-in card to add 2 Gen 5 or M.2 drives. Well, they're SSDs. So the price of this motherboard, though, is $699. So it is very, very expensive. It's right up there with a Crosshair Hero in terms of the price. But it does give you a ton of connectivity. You get the smart button, USB 20 gig ports, DisplayPort alt mode off of USB-C, all that stuff, 10 gigabit LAN. So let's go ahead and take a look at the block diagram. So this one is fully loaded, just like with the Carbon Wi-Fi. You get that option to do X8 in that second slot, and then X8 in the primary, but you do have the full 16 Gen 5. So again, 24 lanes of Gen 5 because it's X670E. You get one M.2 drive that is Gen 5. And then what they have done for the remaining 4 lanes of Gen 5, they have given you, this is probably a very, very unique motherboard in this regard. There is a pure Gen 5 X4 slot off of the CPU that is open for expandability. So this bottom slot down here on the motherboard is a Gen 5 X4 electrically PCIe slot. So that's probably the only one that I've seen that gives you a physical 16 slot for a Gen 5 X4 lanes. So that's really nice. That does also share with an ASMedia 3241 for an additional USB 20 gig port as a Type-C. So that one is actually going to be the one that's on the left there, that is right below the BIOS flashback button. So that one is shared with the X4. So if you want to plug in like a capture card or something in the X4 slot directly to the CPU, that is going to disable this 20 gig USB port right here. But you still do get the 20 gigabit port over here next to the 10 gig LAN. So that is something that I do want to point out. That's not really that big of a deal though in my mind. I do really like that they give you a native X4 slot that goes straight to the CPU that does actually have all the read drivers for PCIe 5. So that is probably one of the reasons why this motherboard is really pricey, because of all those read drivers, and that slot is way down there at the bottom of the motherboard. So there's a lot of like signal integrity. They needed a lot of like read drivers to make that work. So that's pretty cool to see. And then you do have that USB port that does have the alt mode for a monitor. So you can drive a monitor off of one of those USB-C ports on the back. But unfortunately, there's no HDMI or DisplayPort. This is really a enthusiast class motherboard. So they do expect you to have a very high-end GPU in here. That's kind of like understood at this point, or it's kind of like an implicit thing. But you do have the option to drive a monitor off of the integrated graphics if you needed to, in the event of, some, like the GPU died or you had to RMA it or something. So you're stuck with integrated graphics. So that's nice to have that as an option. For the primary chipset, they give you 10 gigabit LAN. So what we have here is they're using a Gen 4 M.2 slot for one of the M.2s. So that means that the only remaining bandwidth available is the 4 lanes of PCIe 3.0. And the way they have allocated that is 2 of the lanes of 3.0 are going to this 10 gig LAN. Now, I don't know if those 2 lanes of Gen 3 are going to potentially make this 10 gig LAN port perform worse than a 10 gig LAN port that's using 2 lanes of Gen 4. But I think that's probably fine to use 2 lanes of Gen 3, because the other 2 lanes of Gen 3 are for a SATA port. So there's 2 SATA drives, each take 1 lane. There's 4 Gen 3 lanes total. So if these 2 are each taking 1 lane, the other 2 lanes have to go to that 10 gig LAN, because the 4 PCIe 4.0 lanes are going to the M.2 drive. So that's kind of how I derive that there. And then for the secondary chipset, we have 2 M.2 drives that are both Gen 4. So that's going to take all 8 lanes of the Gen 4 available bandwidth off of the second chipset. So that again leaves you with 4 lanes of Gen 3. And the way they're doing that is 1 lane goes to Wi-Fi 6E, 2 more lanes go to 2 more SATA ports. So that means 1 more lane is left, and that last lane goes to an ASMedia 1061 chip that will split that lane to allow you to drive 2 SATA drives or 2 SATA ports off of a single PCIe 3.0 lane. So that's how they're kind of eking that out there. So that's interesting to see. So if we count them up, this is 8 lanes of Gen 4. Then you have 1, 2, 3, and 4 lanes of Gen 3. So everything is accounted for and used really, really well. So this motherboard is also a really good recommendation for me if you're looking for an enthusiast class motherboard and you don't care about USB 4. This one's probably the one to go with. It basically has everything. 10 gig networking. Everything you would need really are here. In terms of long haul, like multiple drop-in socket support. This being a flagship product, Ace is MSI's typical flagship motherboard. Basically, if we're just omitting the Godlike at this point. But for the price point, $700, this is kind of the really, really top of the line one there. I really wouldn't recommend anything above this price point. This is kind of what in my mind, I consider the absolute max in terms of how much money I would actually spend on a motherboard. But for most viewers out there, they probably think that's kind of crazy to say that. More people are probably thinking, you know, under 500 is where they would stay. And for something like that, the carbon Wi-Fi is a good choice. So over the Ace, but the Ace does it all, and it does have that expander card, so you can drive, you know, one M.2 Gen 5 off of the primary, and then 2 more off of that X8 slot. So 3 Gen 5 drives plus 3 Gen 4 drives. That's six M.2 drives off of this one motherboard. So that's pretty crazy in terms of storage options. So overall, MSI does have very, very strong offerings for AM5. The one caveat being that MSI is the only vendor that doesn't have the USB 4 or the Thunderbolt options for AMD. So that's really the only downside that I can say or point out looking at these motherboards. Guys, I hope you found this video useful. If you like this content, please leave a like. It does help me out. If you really, really want to dig in more on the sort of deep dive content in terms of technology like this, feel free to subscribe and hit that bell icon if you want to get notified for when I upload another video. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here. And thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.